In 1591, Mexico City, a notable incident occurred involving Geronimo Valverde, the son of a wealthy Spanish merchant. At the time, Geronimo was visiting his uncle's residence. During their quiet conversation, an unexpected interruption took place. Geronimo's father entered the house abruptly, accompanied by a black slave. Shockingly, he confronted his son, brandishing a sword and compelling him into a confined room. There, he proceeded to shackle Geronimo's feet and secured the room with a substantial padlock. To ensure his compliance, a slave was stationed outside the door. Amidst the confusion, the uncle and other relatives sought an explanation for this harsh treatment. The father's response was that Geronimo intended to marry Juana Herrera, a 16-year-old girl who happened to be the daughter of a rival merchant within the city. The father was resolute in preventing this union against his wishes. While confined in his uncle's abode, Geronimo composed a letter addressed to the chief church judge of the city. The following morning, the uncle managed to discreetly deliver the letter to the church. Upon hearing the uncle's account, the chief judge acted. He instructed a royal police official to secure Geronimo's release. The prosecutor and police officer approached Geronimo's father, politely requesting the key to free his son. Regrettably, the request was met with resistance. Resorting to a more serious stance, they warned the father of the potential consequences, including excommunication from the church. Reluctantly, the father yielded and handed over the key, accompanied by a vow to disinherit his son if he proceeded to marry Juana. Following Geronimo's release, the prosecutor inquired whether he remained determined to marry Juana. Undeterred, Geronimo affirmed his commitment. He was then escorted to the church by the prosecutor and police officer. The chief judge endorsed the marriage, bringing this tense episode to a conclusion. What adds a particularly captivating layer to these events is the unexpected stance taken by the ecclesiastic courts. Contrary to what one might expect, they didn't align with the wishes of the affluent merchant. Instead, they actively thwarted his desire to prevent his son from marrying the daughter of a competing merchant. This intriguing turn of events reveals that the church authorities didn't maintain the impartial mediator role typically associated with such disputes between family members. Moreover, it's quite revealing that even Juana's own family was resistant to the proposed marriage. Despite this opposition, the church authorities took a rather drastic step by intervening decisively, removing Juana from her family's home and placing her under protective custody. This action showcases the extent to which the officials of the Catholic Church were willing to assert their influence in cases involving parental authority over their children. Importantly, the incident involving Geronimo and Juana was not an isolated occurrence in early modern Mexico. A series of similar cases existed, all centered around the conflict between a child's personal choice to marry and the resistance they faced from various members of their family. In this video, we'll delve further into these historical disputes, shedding light on the complex dynamics of personal autonomy, familial relationships, and the intriguing role that the Catholic Church played in shaping the outcome of these confrontations. Another example comes in 1629, when Juan Galvan de Segovia, then in his 30s, became a friend of a family named Velasco and frequently visited their home. He became well acquainted with Antonia, the family's teenage daughter. Over the course of time, her mother and Juan had a falling out, possibly over financial issues, which led them to become sworn enemies. Juan was asked to refrain from visiting the home henceforth. However, Juan had fallen in love with Antonia and had asked her to marry him. She agreed. In 1640, a close relative to Antonia, her aunt, asked the mother if she would consent to her daughter's marriage to Juan. The mother became furious, saying she would kill her daughter before she allowed her to marry Juan. She even detailed how she would carry out the threat. She would thrust Antonia's head between two mattresses and suffocate her. Appalled at what she considered the unreasonable objections and excessive reaction of Antonia's mother, Antonia's maternal aunt and uncle espoused the cause of the young couple. They tried for 3 months to convince Antonia's mother, but to no avail. Juan and Antonia agreed to marry secretly, and the aunt and uncle lent their support. They attested that despite the rumors, the two did not engage in sexual relations, and testified that the mother's prejudice against Juan was nothing about the sustainability of the husband to the daughter. Because of the mother's clear intent to do physical harm to Antonia, the church once again interceded and agreed to marry them quietly. They were married on January 28, 1641, a year later. So why was marriage such a persistent source of conflict between parents and children? Well, historians have identified several key factors driving this issue. The foremost reason was economic considerations, especially the transfer of property, land, and family wealth. For parents in the upper and middle classes, marriage was a means of securing and enhancing the family's social status and influence. Consequently, significant importance was placed on arranging marriages to safeguard and expand family resources. Additionally, personal reasons could play a role in a parent's decision not to marry their children to a specific individual, as seen in the case of Juan and Antonia. Although the exact cause of Antonia's mother's dislike for Juan remains unclear, there are indications that a financial disagreement may have been a factor. However, the most extreme instance of marital dispute between children and parents is found in an ecclesiastical record concerning a young couple named Simon and Sebastiana. In 1629, a 26-year-old Spanish man named Simón Nieto wished to marry a 25-year-old widow named Sebastiana Sandoval. However, both families strongly disapproved of the union. Simon's father went so far as to forcibly enter the home of one of his friend's sons, vehemently asserting that if Simón married Sebastiana, he would either sue him for 8,000 pesos or have him arrested and sentenced to 8 years of service in the royal fortress. Another witness to the event overheard Simon's father making threats to send him to the penal colony in the Philippines and to physically harm him. However, Simon's father's intimidation tactics did not stop there. A few days later, he led a group of hired men in a violent intrusion into the friend's home and attacked Simón. Although Simón sustained wounds on his hand and chest, his life was spared when the knife broke against his sternum. Simon's father so vehemently opposed the marriage that he not only threatened to murder his son, but also followed through. The violence wasn't limited to Simon's side. Sebastiana's parents also reacted with aggression. They subjected her to harsh verbal abuse, even threatening to either immolate or confine her in a room for the rest of her life. In response, Sebastiana sought refuge at the home of her first cousin. However, her mother discovered her whereabouts days later and attempted to forcibly remove her from the premises, resorting to scratching and pulling her out of the house. Following these tumultuous events, Sebastiana and Simón approached the ecclesiastical judge in Mexico City for protection. After conducting a hearing that involved testimonies from Sebastiana, Simón, and witnesses who had observed the intense verbal assaults from both sides of the parents, the church ordered the couple to be secretly married on the same day. The root cause of the profound animosity between the Nieto and Sandoval families remained undisclosed. Nevertheless, these three court cases over children's right to choose their marital partners are quite revealing about early modern Mexican society, although admittingly, these might be rather extreme cases, which tends to be the case with historical documentation. The prevailing ideas in the past about parental authority within families clashed with the stance of social control institutions, notably the church during this time period. The church consistently favored the choices of children, overruling parental objections. This contrast was particularly pronounced in the context of marriage, as these three cases illustrate. In the Catholic faith, the importance of freely giving consent for marriage has been emphasized since at least the medieval period. This concept had really deep roots in Catholic tradition, signifying that mutual agreement was the fundamental requirement for a valid marriage. Notably, prior to the 18th century, children possessed the right to marry of their own accord, negating the necessity of parental consent. On the other hand, Protestant beliefs granted civil authorities the power to regulate all aspects of marriage in other Protestant countries in Europe. However, Catholics, as part of the Counter-Reformation movement, began to reject parental consent as a valid aspect of marriage in order to counter Protestant beliefs regarding the issue. During the Counter-Reformation, central to the Catholic teachings on marriage was the idea of its sacred nature, closely tied to the doctrine of free will. The crux of marriage lay in the voluntary agreement between the couple, thus sanctifying an individual's right to make personal choices in the marriage. This is why Catholic priests and judges regularly intervened on the side of the children during marriage disputes within families, which often undermined the absolute authority parents held over children under civil laws. Historically, a common perception was that marriages in eras preceding modern times were often devoid of romantic love, differing from the contemporary notion of marrying for love. Traditionally, marriages were perceived as alliances between families, as well as economic benefits to certain families, prioritizing material considerations and social status over this sort of amorphous concept of love. However, these court cases indicate that this might not have always been the case. Based on the willingness of close family members and even strangers from their own communities intervening on behalf of children, it seems love was a culturally understood valid reason to marry, at least in colonial Mexico. While many marriages in colonial Mexico indeed had economic motives, the prevailing trend in the 16th and 17th century suggests otherwise. Financial incentives to encourage or prevent marriages were generally frowned upon by community members, evident in the intervention of both strangers and acquaintances in couples' affairs. In many cases, the intervention of parents within the child's choice for marriage was sometimes viewed as malicious and even downright harmful. It might be important to point out that in most places in Europe during this time, the control of marriage was largely secular, affirming parental influence over marital decisions. In largely Protestant Northern Europe, as well as Catholic France, parental consent for marriage was often legally mandatory, frequently with the backing of religious authorities. Differently, in Anglican England and Catholic Spain as well as Mexico, each required only the consent of parties involved, lacking any formal provision for parental approval. It actually wouldn't be until 1785 in Mexico that the mediation of marriage conflicts would be removed from the church's jurisdiction and moved to civil authorities. After this date, parents would be granted the power over their children's marriages. This result came about over the penetration of the Enlightenment ideas of Europe into the Spanish Empire, as well as the proliferation of liberal ideas about the separation of church and state, which made marriage a civil affair rather than one solely religious. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe to keep up to date on more historical content. Also, be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments. With that, I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks and goodbye.